Bueno, muy buenos días a todos. Nuevamente, muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta nueva sesión de Martes Patrimoniales. Ya este es nuestro octavo Martes Patrimonial que tenemos en el día de hoy. Eh, Tenemos, como siempre, interpretación en inglés y en español y portugués en la barra baja del Zoom, en el icono de la Tierra. We have interpretation in English, Spanish and Portuguese in the icon of the world of the Zoom device. Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias. Tenemos con nosotros hoy a Jesús Navarrete, quien es el coordinador de la plataforma de Patrimonio Vivo. Como siempre, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Estaremos esperando su participación a través del chat. En el momento que abren nuestros ponentes, a través del chat pueden enviarnos sus preguntas para hacerlas llegar al moderador y justamente al ponente. Muchísimas gracias y adelante, Jesús.
Muy bien. Buenas tardes. Bueno, bienvenidos de nuevo a una más de nuestros martes patrimoniales. Gracias, Luis Manuel. Hoy tenemos el gusto de contar con una ponencia y una presentadora estupenda, Erika Avrami, que nos va a presentar un tema que es de extrema relevancia para nuestro trabajo en la preservación del patrimonio urbano. Como todos sabemos, los procesos de revitalización patrimonial son, por naturaleza, de carácter multisectorial. Eso se reconoce dentro del abordaje que tenemos nosotros del programa Patrimonio Vivo, en donde este programa se sustenta sobre 5 pilares, cada uno de ellos con unos objetivos específicos: el promover la inclusión, el promover la productividad, la participación, alcanzar la resiliencia y la ecoeficiencia, ¿no? Como resultado, siempre trabajamos con diversos sectores y con diferentes actores. Estos evidentemente tienen sus intereses propios y sus prioridades propias. El punto que nosotros encontramos y un reto que es realmente importante para todos nosotros en el sector es cómo balanceamos y cómo hacemos la negociación de este tipo de intereses y de este tipo de prioridades, de tal manera de que podamos sacar el mayor provecho, digamos, o tener el mayor impacto de las intervenciones que hacemos con el patrimonio. Alcanzar este balance es siempre importante porque, primero, nos permitiría lograr la efectividad de nuestras intervenciones, el éxito de las intervenciones, pero también nos permite garantizar la sostenibilidad de la misma. Y de inmediato lo que nos permite es evitar la paralización del proceso y también, pues, evitar cualquier conflicto, ¿no? Sobre eso es que nos va a hablar la doctora Erika Avrami, a quien le damos las gracias por permitirnos conversar con ella y por compartirnos su experiencia. Erika es la profesora James Marston Fitch de Preservación Histórica del Columbia University en Nueva York. Está también afiliada al Centro para el Desarrollo Urbano Sostenible del Instituto de la Tierra y actualmente su investigación se concentra en la interacción del patrimonio y la sostenibilidad urbana, específicamente en el papel que juega la preservación del patrimonio, los valores sociales y los problemas de justicia espacial en estos procesos. Erika ha trabajado también en el Fondo Mundial de Monumentos y en la Fundación Getty. Como una profesora exitosa, pues tiene muchas publicaciones y trabaja para varias, como editora de varias revistas. Erika, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to participate in these Heritage Tuesday talks. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we are looking forward to your talk. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesus. Thank you to everyone at the Inter-American Development Bank for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor, and it's also a privilege to be able to think about some of this work retrospectively and to consider how it influences our thinking as we move forward in trying to really integrate heritage considerations within broader questions of sustainable development. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so everyone should be able to see at this point. This talk will explore the complexities of integrating heritage and more specifically the values of the heritage enterprise into sustainable and community-oriented urban investment. As a point of clarification, when I refer to the heritage enterprise, I mean the institutions, experts, and policies that have agency or governance over the conservation of officially recognized heritage places, from UNESCO at the international level to national ministries of culture to local offices and organizations. I'll present 4 cases, 3 of which I managed in my former role at World Monuments Fund, which I'll continue throughout this talk to refer to as WMF. I'll use the first of these, New Gurna in Luxor, Egypt, to illustrate the conflicting values and power relationships that can challenge the integration of social and economic and environmental interests within heritage agendas. And then I'll discuss 2 additional projects, one related to cruise tourism in historic port communities, and the other related to tourism and creative placemaking along Route 66 in the United States. And I'll use those 2 to demonstrate how in these projects, we learned our lessons from New Gurna and we invested more purposefully in evidence-based research and coalition building, going beyond the traditional core of the heritage enterprise to more successfully overcome some of those challenges of balancing and integrating. And finally, I'll take a couple of minutes to discuss some current academic research I'm doing based here in the US and specifically focused on New York, which builds on some of these lessons learned and helps to kind of think about how we evolve heritage policy toward justice, toward equity, and toward climate-related action. So New Gurna Village. It's located on the west bank of the Nile River between the urban core of Luxor and the Valley of the Kings. So here you can see it up here. Here, the Valley of the Kings is here, and the core of Luxor is over here. Design of the village was commissioned by the government in the 1940s to relocate residents living near the pharaonic sites, which were being developed as tourist destinations. But for a number of reasons, only a portion of the original plan was ultimately constructed. Designed by the renowned architect Hassan Fatih and the subject of his book, Architecture for the Poor, the village was an experiment in appropriate technology and participatory design, and one that emphasized spaces of community interaction through schools, a mosque, a khan, and more. Intended as a model of public housing, and perhaps the codification of a national style at an important political moment for the country of Egypt, the earthen dome dwellings gained international attention. And Fatih truly inspired a new generation of architects and planners worldwide through his integration of traditional materials with modern architectural principles, and by championing the inclusion and empowerment of societies less fortunate. In fact, Jesus and I were just talking before the start of this webinar about, Hassan Fatih, both of us having been trained in architecture and recognizing the influence he had over that education. So while New Gurna is located within the boundaries of the UNESCO World Heritage Site of ancient Thebes, it was not considered an important resource at the time that the World Heritage Site was designated, which was 1979. It was actually not until the 2000s that earth and architecture experts and the international heritage community advocated for its protection and conservation. And the governor of Luxor began to see its potential as a strategic tourism destination located between the city's core and that Valley of the Kings where the pharaonic sites are. UNESCO then initiated a safeguarding project and sought to develop a master plan for New Gurna's conservation and approached World Monuments Fund, WMF, to collaborate in 2010. Now, UNESCO focused its efforts on a traditional heritage field survey, prioritizing physical fabric, original design, surveying original materials and conditions, and it established an international scientific committee, of which I was a member, that included only heritage experts. And UNESCO estimated that more than 40% of the original Fatih buildings had been lost, replaced, or significantly modified. And many within UNESCO's International Scientific Committee perceived the residents of the village as the cause of New Gurna's physical deterioration. Now, in parallel to UNESCO's work, WMF undertook a community assessment with the broader aim of building the capacities of heritage institutions to engage with and empower communities, and with the more specific objective of understanding community values, behaviors, and aspirations within New Gurna. We analyzed social and economic conditions, identified factors of change within the community environment, studied use of space and adaptation patterns, and sought to understand the community's attachment to place and concerns for its future. We found that there was a great deal of respect for Fatih and his ideals, alongside evidence of a number of social, economic, and environmental factors influencing changes to that original architecture. These included changing groundwater and environmental conditions, poor original construction and materials, as well as social factors that compelled spatial and physical changes, as more than 65% of the households in New Gurna had 6 or more members, and living spaces were originally designed for much smaller families. To accommodate these evolving needs, original buildings were repurposed, subdivided, and in some cases replaced entirely. But while the village population had actually more than doubled and the buildings changed, the plan of the village and the building footprints had not been substantially altered. The construction completed in the 1940s provided for 77 households. As of 2010, 174 households were occupying the same space by expanding vertically. From an environmental perspective, this demonstrates sustainable densification of the village in a way that protected the surrounding agricultural lands upon which residents depended. These design alterations and the use of modern materials were largely perceived by heritage experts, though, as disregard for Fatih's original design. However, while many structures have been significantly altered, the intangible values that Fatih promoted are nonetheless woven into the social and physical fabric of the village. Fatih's mixed-use vision and plan for the community fundamentally thrived. He gave dimensions to notions of urban intimacy, access to education, and community engagement. And these elements continue to serve as cornerstones of New Gurna's physical and social foundation. The mosque and community hall remain centerpieces of worship and congregation. Communal baking and agricultural fields are in continued use. Fatih also insisted on the construction of schools as part of the integrated mixed-use plan for New Gurna, and community members remain strongly tied to and proud of this history of access to education. While the original school buildings themselves do not survive, a modern replacement serves as a vibrant element of the community to which children can walk easily and safely. And I should note that the village actually has a higher literacy rate than the rest of the country on average. Fati also provided venues for community encounters that continue to contribute to social capital, and interstitial spaces are an important component of the public landscape of the village. Contemporary streetscapes contain sleeping benches and other furniture, and they underscore the sense of safety in the village. Through WMF's research, we discovered that while many residents highly value Fati's legacy and the sort of historic and aesthetic vision he had, they do not feel wed to his original residential designs. These communal places and spaces, instead shown on the screen, represent those things that are highly valued by the community, and they were the lasting legacies of Fati that the community fundamentally sought to preserve. This stood in contrast to the interests of the heritage enterprise, and specifically the majority of the UNESCO International Scientific Committee members, who prioritized those historic and aesthetic values of Fati's original design and materials as a complete urban ensemble. And they sought to have those forms, both public and private in nature, restored. The decisions residents had taken to remain in, manage, and maintain New Gurna derived from a host of factors. Many already worked in the tourism industry and saw the tourism potential of the village as an asset that could be capitalized on. However, the modification of the original architecture should not be readily dismissed as a lack of respect for Fati's legacy or a failure to recognize the touristic value of the village. On the contrary, New Gurna holds significant meaning for its residents. More than 78% want to remain in the village, or at least as of 2010. And this sense of grounding was accompanied by the realization of the significance of Fati's work. Over half of the interviewed residents believed that Fati and the model he created at New Gurna were of great importance, but the residential buildings themselves are no longer adequate for current conditions and lifestyles. Given these tensions and the associated power disparities, WMF published its assessment as a separate parallel publication from UNESCO's in order to ensure that the community perspective was effectively represented. And we also produced a community film to literally give voice to community members in the project. And the film was shown to the UNESCO International Scientific Committee since the community had no actual representation within the committee itself. WMF fundamentally sought to empower the residents as legitimate stakeholders in decision-making about New Gurna's future, and to underscore that heritage decision-making cannot be divorced from issues of social and spatial justice. The heritage enterprise writ large, and particularly the normative operating procedures of the World Heritage System, afforded a limited toolbox for negotiating many of these tensions. To many, the heritage value, as well as any tourism-related economic value, could only be realized through adherence to Fati's original form. And despite WMF's efforts to amplify the voices of the people, the disparate power of the community in the face of government and international interests precluded the possibility of shared visioning and decision-making. And despite the community findings and evidence produced through WMF's research, the UNESCO project produced a preliminary master plan calling for the restoration of the remaining Fati designed buildings, as well as the demolition or height reduction of many of the replacement and highly altered buildings, which would have relocated a significant number of residents and potentially fractured the social and familial dynamics within the village. With the events of February of 2011 in Egypt and the resignation of President Mubarak, the work of both WMF and UNESCO was halted. However, the New Gurna project served as an important touchstone for WMF, or at least for me as a heritage professional. It underscored some critical concerns that the heritage enterprise may be ill-equipped to negotiate, let alone reconcile, social, economic, and environmental concerns within its governance structures, institutional policies, and professional practice. So moving on to the second case, which I promise will get quicker. This, rather than dealing necessarily with a specific site, really dealt with a larger set of policy issues and tested this question of balancing interests and power dynamics. In 2012, the downtown of Charleston, South Carolina, one of the first historic districts to be formally recognized in the United States, was included on the World Monuments Watch, which is an advocacy program that seeks to draw international awareness to heritage potentially at risk. Charleston was in the throes of a heated political debate over increased cruise tourism in its port. While the city had long been a tourism destination and had built a thriving tourism economy, it was not prepared to accommodate the influx of thousands of visitors debarking from cruise ships into the historic commercial and residential center. Heritage advocates and concerned citizens had mounted a campaign to limit the size and frequency of cruise arrivals, and had likewise built a body of evidence around the detrimental environmental effects, as well as the negative impacts on the local economy. They raised concerns that the day tripping cruise ship visitors would undermine stayover visitation, which generates more tax revenue for the city and supports local businesses and hotels. And ultimately, it would degrade the historic environment of Charleston, which was key to its touristic value. The challenges in Charleston were not unique, as we know, with Venice on the screen. Historic port communities around the world continue to contend with the pressure and effects of the very powerful cruise tourism industry. It became apparent that this was not a heritage issue that could be confronted on a site-by-site or city-by-city basis. The cruise industry is able to marshal significant resources to lobby for port access. And this is compounded by the fact that more often than not, negotiations regarding cruise terminal development and ship dockings are undertaken by port authorities at state, regional, or national levels, rather than by the cities or municipalities directly affected. The international trade and security issues associated with port management understandably require that higher government engagement, but failure to include local community level stakeholders often results in the exploitation of local heritage resources and values. Now, a body of evidence was needed to support those seeking to manage and mitigate the effects of cruise tourism within their communities, even beyond Charleston. Making the case for Charleston alone would not redress the effects of cruise tourism across the globe. There was a need to understand and demonstrate the systemic effects of cruise tourism in social, environmental, and economic terms, so that those empowered to take decisions about cruise ship access understood the trade-offs and could promote effective management. Likewise, those confronting government and industry and its associated power needed strength in numbers. Thus, WMUF saw its role as one of building not only a body of evidence, but also building coalitions by connecting communities facing similar challenges to each other and connecting those communities to those engaged in the many facets of cruise tourism research and policy development. So the following year, after Charleston was included on the World Monuments Watch, WMF hosted a symposium that gathered experts from around the world to examine various approaches to cruise tourism and historic port communities, with the intent of exploring sustainable practices as well as common challenges. The event sought to gather perspectives from well beyond the traditional core of the heritage enterprise. It included those dealing with air, water, and noise pollution, the degradation and protection of natural habitats, passenger safety, impacts on local businesses and economies, tax-based approaches to cruise tourism, and more. And strategic and collective negotiating across all of these different sectors was highlighted as a critical means of brokering community benefits and mitigating harm. While there was a clear understanding that cruise tourism was negatively impacting many particularly smaller historic port communities, heritage institutions, policymakers, and practitioners in places like Charleston had limited agency and resources. Their missions and mandates are largely local, which inhibits their capacity to bridge disciplinary divides and move beyond geopolitical borders. In contrast to the New Guernsey case, WMF realized that the collective agency required to challenge political and industry power requires allies and accomplices from beyond the core of the heritage enterprise. And this kind of coalition building with different sector organization focused on the environment, focused on economic development, focused on public health and social justice, enhanced the toolbox and political concurrency of the heritage actors, and also helped to establish new platforms for negotiating shared values and achieving common goals. Indeed, the publication that actually resulted from the symposium has been used successfully as legal evidence in at least 3 court cases involving community-driven bans on big ship cruise tourism, demonstrating how that coalition building and evidence building came together to serve literally as a legal foundation for challenging cruise tourism. The third case that I'll discuss today is Route 66. It probably doesn't need much of an explanation, but I will go into just a little bit. It's a unique US landscape. Once a thriving thoroughfare connecting Chicago to Los Angeles, it was bypassed by large highways, and many towns declined and businesses were shuttered. And because it was decommissioned as a federal or national roadway, management of the historic corridor was fractured, and attempts at wayfinding, tourism development, and economic investment across what's familiarly known as the Mother Road were happening in isolation. And still to this day, there is no unified heritage designation for the route, although many sites along the route are actually designated. Back in 2008, Route 66 was nominated to the World Monuments Watch, similar to Charleston, to raise awareness of its history and its conservation. WMF's traditional mode of action is through supporting the physical conservation of heritage sites. But Route 66 encompasses hundreds, if not thousands, of significant places, ranging from vast natural and cultural landscapes to quirky towns and roadside attractions, all bookended by 2 of the largest cities in the country, Los Angeles and Chicago. It has an international reputation as the quintessential road trip, made famous in music, literature, and film. And WMF quickly realized that conservation of a single Route 66 heritage site could not catalyze investment in a corridor that's 2,400 miles long and running through 8 states, 7 geological regions, and more than 300 communities. So instead, WMF worked with the US National Park Service and Rutgers University to launch research into the economic and social value of Route 66 as a whole. This culminated in an economic impact study that was published in 2012 that aggregated data from across the 8 states about the economic revenue and jobs generated by heritage tourism, and it found that preserving Route 66 is a good investment on multiple fronts, with some of the indicators listed on the slide. The study also developed a series of community case studies to understand how different places were capitalizing on their Route 66 heritage to promote community and economic development, and particularly creative placemaking. So not only preservation, but new development as well. This afforded analysis of the many actors and stakeholders along the route and the different ways in which communities were mobilizing projects, including conservation and new development, as I just mentioned, using market-based as well as regulatory policy tools to spur economic activity through this still sort of heritage and Route 66 culture-related tourism. The study thus produced both quantitative and qualitative evidence to support investment in Route 66 writ large. And this served as a powerful piece of collateral in leveraging interest on the part of media and decision makers. But WMF knew that very few people were going to read a 700-page economic impact study, right? And the evidence alone would not spur investment. We needed to build capacities on the ground and connect the many disparate actors and communities who were working, somewhat in concert, but fairly independently, and certainly across a broad geographic stretch. While each of the 8 states through which Route 66 runs had a not-for-profit association whose mission focused on the conservation of Route 66, and each had state and municipal level tourism agencies marketing the route, there just wasn't that much coordination and collaboration. And we realized that harnessing the collective agency to tackle Route 66 required, again, coalition building across geographies, across political borders, across professions and disciplines, and involving multiple government agencies at the federal, state, and local levels. So we organized a strategic roundtable in 2014 titled The Road Ahead, inviting more than 100 key figures from heritage, tourism, economic, and community development from both the public and private sectors and from across the 8 states and beyond. And capitalizing on the role of Route 66 in the animated Disney movie Cars, we hosted the event in Disneyland to create a draw as well as orient focus on the touristic marketing potential of Route 66. So yes, World Monuments Fund, an international heritage organization, chose to host this event in Disneyland. I realize the irony of that. We recognized that we had little chance of forging a coalition simply around heritage conservation, nor did we see that as representing public interests along the route, which varied but largely centered on economic opportunity and equity. We had to reach beyond the traditional core of the heritage enterprise and establish a platform that would support cross-sector negotiation and trade-offs and empower the many disparate stakeholders along the route. So we centered the dialogue on how the multiple stories and publics of Route 66 could be an agent for change and sustainable development. And we curated the program to ensure we had a roster of speakers who concretely illustrated how revitalization was already happening in discrete places along the route, and how forging stronger connections across organizations, across municipalities, across states could reap shared benefits. And then we asked about 15 critical actors to stay for an extra day after the roundtable, during which we developed a refined plan of action for coalition building and an initial steering committee. We continue to provide facilitation assistance to the steering committee to refine the plan of action and to build buy-in across state organizations and especially government agencies. And in 2016, 8 years after Route 66 was included on the World Monuments Watch, the Road Ahead Partnership was officially incorporated as a not-for-profit umbrella organization for all 8 states and all communities. The group encompasses a broad mission that includes economic development, tourism promotion, research, education, all in support of the diverse communities along the corridor, using heritage as a tool for collective action, but heritage and its conservation don't serve as the sole objective. So the 3 cases I've discussed so far explore how heritage agency is organized and oriented, pushing the intention to conserve beyond the physical safeguarding of places and toward the social, economic, and environmental aspirations we hope to achieve by conserving, and its attendant negotiation of power, publics, and values. As I've transitioned out of my work in heritage institutions and into academia, I continue to ponder this question of intention and how systemic or structural conditions within the heritage enterprise may inhibit or inspire our capacity to instrumentalize heritage toward bolder aims of justice, equity, and climate resilience. Ambitious things must be endeavored together, and collective agency requires shared vision as well as sacrifice and compromise. Is the heritage enterprise prepared for the growing challenges and trade-offs that such ambitions may incur? To explore this question, I undertook a research project that focused on the concept of intention, or why we as collective societies conserve. This may sound like a rhetorical question, or in my case, a possible existential crisis, but there was a fairly simple scope and method to the inquiry. In the context of the United States, all laws, including local heritage ordinances, have something akin to a public policy rationale that states the reason why government is taking on a particular purpose or action in the interest of the general populace, or the grounds on which the law is basically justified. I and colleagues reviewed municipal heritage ordinances across all 50 states in the US, including the most populous cities, which represented a concentration of people, and the state capitals, which represented a concentration of institutions. We analyzed the public policy rationale of each and categorized intentions, and these broadly fell under four main rationales: social, economic, environmental, and aesthetic. I don't have time to dive deeply into each of these categories and all of the data, but we can certainly post a link to the article so that you can see all of it. But I will give you a broad brush summary. The social benefits of preservation were found to be the most prevalent rationales for government action, followed closely by economic rationales. There are few intentions, however, oriented toward social justice and equity explicitly. And civic engagement, and I think about this in the context of New Gurna and the way in which we were trying to give voice to a community, civic engagement is actually called out as a rationale in only about 10% of US ordinances. Environmental and aesthetic rationales actually occurred much less frequently. These findings hint at some potential challenges on the horizon, particularly on the environmental front, if the heritage enterprise seeks to tackle climate mitigation and adaptation within the intention of the heritage enterprise. Because if the policy mandate doesn't exist, how can you operationalize it within institutions? Now, to understand these public policy rationales in relationship to how preservation actually happens on the ground, or how heritage conservation actually happens on the ground, we look to understand how the general public perceives the rationales of heritage conservation. And so we undertook a sample survey through multiple platforms in New York City. And we asked people to rank the importance of particular rationales when conserving historic districts in the city. And we derived these rationales from the legislation. So when people, average people, were asked, aesthetics ranked the highest in terms of the rationales for why we preserve, with social rationales following closely behind, things like education, fostering civic pride. And civic engagement, was a little higher up there in the public perception as well. Environmental rationales ranked in the middle. And despite the emphasis on economic benefits called out in municipal ordinances across the country and in New York City specifically, and despite the focus on the economic impacts of heritage in contemporary discourse and even the heritage field advocacy, all economic-oriented rationales ranked in the lowest third in the survey results among public perceptions, meaning the public does not see economics as a rationale for heritage conservation. While these results are not representative of all municipalities, there are some startling disconnects between how government defines the intentions of heritage policy, at least in New York City, and how publics perceive those intentions, especially in light of the importance of justice and climate in contemporary discourse, as well as economic equity. Even more concerning were the demographics of the self-selected survey respondents, who tracked much older, whiter, wealthier, and more educated than citywide averages in New York. And this suggested that those who had an affinity to heritage conservation tended to be a more privileged public. These findings hint at institutional challenges to optimizing the use of heritage in the sustainable development of cities. While heritage may serve a multitude of purposes, it will be increasingly incumbent upon government and related institutions to ensure that heritage decision-making processes are just, inclusive, and accessible, and that the outcomes or benefits engendered by such processes are equitably distributed. This fundamentally incurs the navigation of complex legacies of power and exclusion, and increased fluency with the environmental, economic, and social dimensions of spatial histories and contemporary claims to space. So I thank you for listening, and I invite questions.
Hi, Erica. Thank you very much for your presentation. So our first question that we have is, when you are discussing your projects, you seem to suggest that coalition building is not as common in the heritage enterprise as, say, in other aspects of urban policy. Do you think that is the case? And if so, can you explain why this is?
So, you know, I hadn't really thought deeply about this until being asked to give this talk. And I think actually that there are some limitations to coalition building within the heritage enterprise. And as someone who is also an urban planner, I see much more robust coalition building in other areas of urban policy. And I think part of that has to do with the way in which the heritage enterprise too often sees its goals and its work in binary terms, meaning the building or the site is saved, the building or the site is not saved. It's protected or it's not protected. We've, you know, removed it from market forces of development, or we haven't removed it from market forces of development. And I think that inclination toward regulation, you know, command and control policy, as opposed to market-based incentives, means that we all too often kind of take a normative approach. And if you think about the heritage field, we are absolutely littered with charters, right? Lots and lots of international charters, national charters, scientific committee charters about how we should preserve. And you know, that suggests that, you know, at times we are not kind of thinking creatively, or not affording the kind of platform that allows for multiple perspectives. And I think coalition building fundamentally compels us to think differently. It fundamentally compels us to look, you know, at our work as a Venn diagram, to see how our interests overlap with those of community development, with those of economic equity, and to find the spaces of common ground. And I do think that the future of the field in some ways really will be contingent on its ability to more effectively build those coalitions.
Thank you very much. So a next question I have is referencing to the sustainability of some of these projects that you have discussed. So particularly, I want to focus on the tourism, cruise ship, port management example that you gave, in kind of addressing, as you mentioned, you know, tourism and the industry, the cruise ship industry was very strong. So what ways can other countries or other port cities with preservation or important heritage elements, how can they leverage this to kind of, you know, counteract or work with this industry to find a balance and really understand and kind of revalue the heritage within these areas without compromising what can be economic development and growth, and also a sustainable aspect, because as we know, cruise ships can be quite detrimental to the environment.
So, it's in our current situation with the pandemic, and certainly cruise tourism has taken a hit. And so, there's a part of me that is a little reticent to speculate too much, because we don't know what's going to happen with the cruise tourism industry, right? Given this kind of shockwave that's gone through the tourism industry writ large. But certainly on with regard to cruise tourism, I do think that the sort of kind of vertical integration of government policy is critical. We, at least in the examples that we saw through the symposium and the colleagues with whom we worked trying to develop case studies, we consistently saw this kind of lack of communication and coordination from the local level up to the national level or the state level, because it's as I mentioned in the talk, it's often those upper levels of government that have ultimate control over the port. And so they're brokering economic deals that fundamentally may be detrimental to the municipality, but the municipality doesn't have that kind of voice in decision making. And so, one of the more interesting cases that I think I showed an image of the Fjord Norway, was that they really they saw this problem, and they actually did a very interesting survey and research project to recognize the extent to which this increase in tourism that was being caused by cruise ships. I mean, they were in some of those small towns along the fjords, they would see, population, in a day increase from 250 to 12,000 all of a sudden. And so they were able to, undertake a survey to understand how people perceived the degradation of that experience, as well as quantify in monetary terms what the annual cost of that degradation would be in terms of lost tourism revenue. Because the more cruise tourists came, the more they would basically degrade the resource, and the more higher paying tourism would decline. And if I remember correctly, they were able to quantify that between $175 and $825 million per year. And it was that kind of analysis and reckoning with this decision making that enabled the local communities and tourism agencies to actually get access to the negotiating table with the cruise industry. And they formed, again, a coalition around this to be able to collective bargain, right? To be able to have strength in numbers and to say, nope, sorry, it's no community along the fjords unless you are considering all of these requirements that help us manage. And that really became evident, that if communities are willing to talk to each other, they actually become a really strong and powerful wall against some of the more egregious behavior of the cruise tourism industry, because ships need to dock, they need to come into port. And when there's coordinated efforts along some of these tourism routes, they can effectively negotiate for more environmentally responsible, more socially responsible, more economically responsible management of those ships when they are in port.
Great, thank you very much, Erica. So we are going to, let me pass this over to Jesus for one closing question.
Thank you, Tatiana. Erica, thank you very much for the presentation. I just, while you were talking, explaining your cases. The name of the presentation in Spanish was something related to balancing interests, but something like that. And I was just thinking that, to me, seems to be very important in here is how you balance the negotiation process itself. You know, I mean, when you have to negotiate with powerful economic interests, like you were describing the cruise companies, or sometimes it's hotels, or sometimes it's other kind of, sometimes very much associated to tourism, for example. And you have communities or you have municipalities that do not have the means, neither the capacity to, I would say, to have a balanced negotiation. You mentioned the construction of coalitions, which I believe could be very effective when you have like communities that have that capacity to join together, recognize their common interests, and try to put forward those in this negotiation. But what about, is there other kind of instruments or approaches that can be developed from the public perspective that incentivize this kind of coalition, but not only among, for example, different communities that are affected by the same problem or the same kind of proposal, but even among the communities and the municipalities, which sometimes are also weak, as you probably know. So do you see something else in there? Do you see, what kind of change do you see that could be undertaken in that regard?
You know, that it's a terrific question, and I don't know that I can fully answer it. And you know, the cases that I showed were from my experiences at World Monuments Fund, and you know, largely through the idea of the World Monuments Watch, right? Which is you know, not a designation of any kind. It's simply an advocacy program, right? It's a platform, and you know what, in many respects, was part of the more rewarding, you know, aspect of that program, and having the privilege of being involved with it, is that this, you know, sometimes it's just the platform that takes a very small local issue or a very small local entity and gives it attention at an international level. It amplifies in that way. And I do think that, you know, in the era of social media, we now have all of these different kinds of platforms for amplification and connecting, but we don't all have the same power and skills and capacities to do that work. And so, you know, it's a question that I think we haven't quite grappled with in the heritage field to the extent that I would really like us to. And I think where we have gotten better at it is advocating for particular sites, right? Like, this place is under threat, or this is at risk, or, you know, this should be nominated, or this should be historic, or here's a picture of me at this site. Let's everyone take a picture at this site. But we're not finding the ways to use those platforms to really think about the much less sexy stuff, right? The policy stuff, the sort of operations of municipal government. You know, when a heritage agency, a government agency, is mostly charged with designating buildings and doing design review to make sure that changes to a building are within, you know, are appropriate and things like that, how do they think about these larger issues? In the case of Charleston, they absolutely, you know, struggled with that. You know, they had to deal with their historic district. Like, what do we do with the cruise ship? Like, what? How do we tackle that? And I do think kind of finding some of those platforms for, you know, for amplification is important. But I also think kind of thinking about it as policy and as shared goals as opposed to an individual site is critical. And I do think that, you know, fundamentally means that as a heritage kind of enterprise, we need to be finding and forging allies in other fields, not simply among heritage organizations, but in other fields. And we need to be able to translate the work of heritage and its relationship, whether that's through water management and conservation, whether that's through job creation, whether that's through forms of tourism. I think that we're all too often focused on preserving the resource, the object, the thing, that we're not really formulating agendas that can connect to larger policy conversations. It's a great question, Jesus, and I wish I had a better answer for you, but
no, but I guess what you're saying is that we have to be like we have to open our scope and not only focusing on what the object is, but also the whole potential of it for development, and then building that coalition that you were talking about, but maybe in a broader kind of with a broader scope, as you say, different institutions, different sectors. But it's true, we have to work through policy to that, to make it, to give it the strength that it needs, and especially for it to occur whenever this kind of situation happens, and not necessarily sporadically or by accident, or when an institution like your institution or our institutions comes and try to help them.
Well, yeah, I mean, the example that keeps coming to mind is when I worked at World Monuments Fund, and then through my role at Columbia, I've had the opportunity to work in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. And what was interesting was we were focused on gingerbread houses in the context of the city. And what was really interesting was that the partner organization on the ground with whom we worked was an education and social justice organization, Focal, supported by Soros Open Society Institutes. I mean, they didn't explicitly have a heritage mission, right? They were about social justice, democracy, representation, education, but they were able to see the way in which cultural heritage served as a vehicle for their work. That's right. And served as a way to connect with broader constituencies. And so they were exceedingly kind of creative and forward thinking in that regard. And I don't know that we can expect that of environmental organizations around the world or community development organizations around the world. I think we have to do some heavier lifting on the heritage side to help envision those possibilities.
I agree. Well, Erica, thank you so much. Time is up right now, but thank you so much for your presentation, for accepting our invitation. And I don't know if there's more questions. If there is more questions, we're gonna send it to you, and maybe you can respond them, and then we'll share it with the people that have asked them. So thank you so much. This is with this we say goodbye, and we expect to see you in the next Heritage Tuesday and on the 1st of December. Okay.
Thank
bye-bye,
you.
and thank you. Bye-bye.